Now for today's program. Anita Diamant is an award-winning journalist and author. Her books include the New York Times bestseller, The Red Tent, which was a winner of the 2001 BookSense Book of the Year Award. The Red Tent has been published in more than 25 countries and was adapted into a two-part miniseries by Lifetime TV. Anita's other best-selling novels include The Boston Girl, Day After Night, The Last Days of Dogtown, and Good Harbor. Her nonfiction guides to contemporary Jewish life include The Jewish Wedding Now, The Jewish Baby Book, Living a Jewish Life, Choosing a Jewish Life, How to Raise a Jewish Child, and Saying Kaddish. Her book, Pitching My Tent, is drawn from her 20 years of newspaper and magazine columns. Her work has appeared in such magazines as Real Simple, Parenting, Hadassah, Reform Judaism, and Boston Magazine. Anita's latest book is Period, End of Sentence, the new chapter in the fight for menstrual justice. Joining Anita today is Amy E. Schwartz. Amy is Moment Magazine's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and an op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, covering education, science, and culture. She was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in Commentary in 1988 and was a three-time winner of the Newspaper Guild's Bernie Harrison Memorial Award for Commentary and Criticism. Amy has also worked at Harper's Magazine, The New Republic, and the Wilson Quarterly. She is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Study Center in Washington, D.C., and speaks and runs workshops on the topics of Jewish commentary, psalms, and literature nationwide. Amy is the editor of the book, Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Please welcome Anita Diamant and Amy E. Schwartz.
Hi, Anita. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you everybody for coming. Anita, it is a pleasure and a privilege to talk with you about your books, including the most recent book, Period, End of Sentence. Actually, let me say that I'm glad the topic for today is so widely drawn. It's not just about this book or all your books even, but about the world of Anita Diamant. And I'm pleased about this because you've written so many books, not only so many wonderful books on many different topics, but also so many kinds of different books. You started, as Suzanne said in the intro, you started with your series of guides to Jewish living, which took many of us sort of through the life cycle, the New Jewish Wedding, the New Jewish Baby Book, Raising a Jewish Child, all the way up through Saying Kaddish. You've written most famously, of course, the historical novels, one of which, The Red Tent, has actually attained the status of feminist midrash. You've written essays, you've written journalism, and you've also become a Jewish community activist of sorts in starting Hayyim, or helping found Hayyim, the progressive mikveh in the Boston area. And then, most recently, you've written what might be called a book about community activism, a guide to action on a particular issue of menstrual justice. So with all that said, I wanted to start by asking you, of all these modes, which one is the most you? Which ones do you find the most rewarding? Which ones come easiest? And is it hard to shift from one to the other?
Whoa. Hi, that's a boatload of questions. But first of all, thank you, Moment, and thank you everybody for tuning in. And the wonderful world of Anita Diamant makes me think of Disney, so we should have had Tinkerbell at the beginning. I find writing fiction harder than writing nonfiction. I wrote nonfiction for many years before I tried writing a novel, and it's a much more, it's more clear to me what the beginning, the middle, and the end is. Writing service features for a magazine, for example, and then writing a book on Jewish weddings for the liberal North American Jewish community, there's a certain amount of information, so make it as well written as possible, but there's a certain amount of material with fiction. You can go anywhere, and that can be paralyzing, actually, at some points in writing fiction. So yeah, and I think maybe my favorite form is short essays, which are both personal and reported. Some of them more personal, some of them more reported, and the best ones are both. They include reportage and my response to that. And I continue to do that, mostly for Cognoscenti, which is the WBUR, which is one of the local NPR stations here, has a great online magazine. So I continued to do that for them. And I had actually written a couple of those pieces about menstrual justice long before this book ever was a possibility.
So, and you've collected those most recently in the anthology Pitching My Tent, right?
Actually, that's a very old anthology. Okay. So it's it was published, I don't even know how long ago. It's at least 15 years ago. So it was pieces I wrote for the Boston Globe magazine and for Parenting magazine, and a few other places. And I also have written for Moment.
That's right. You've back a ways.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, that was maybe a hard sort of a writer's question, and I apologize for starting you off difficult. This is maybe an easier question. So one thing, obviously, you're famous for is your fabulous gallery of strong female characters from every era, from many different historical eras. Starting with Leah and Dina in The Red Tent, and you have Holocaust survivors in New Lives for Old. You've got these tough New England women in The Last Days of Dogtown, which is sort of 1800s, and then the Boston Girl. Addie Baum is sort of the age my grandmother would have been. She's born right around the turn of the century, I guess. So of all these women, how do you get inside women from these far off times? Do some of them, do they reflect you in some way, or do they seem very, very different from you? Like, what's that all like?
Well, my goal I think the through line in all of my fiction, is as different as they all are, is a celebration of women's strength and agency. So the heroines of these books are not passive at all. They, even if they're in difficult straits, psychological or in the real world, which doesn't mean they always triumph. It doesn't mean it's always happy, but they survive, and many thrive, at least for parts of their lives. And I think that comes from the feminism that I imbibed as a college student. I guess that's when I went to college in 1969. I started, and centering women, that's a new verb, which I'm starting to like, is what I do. A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf turned me into a writer about women. And that's true for nonfiction, that's true for the journalism I've done, and certainly in the fiction that I've done. So I think that's the through line in all of them. And then making them real in terms of the worlds they're living in is a matter of research. And trying to, the hardest one was in some ways, well, actually, anything in the past, people didn't talk so much about their feelings. So we live in a confessional time, and people are always processing what they feel. So in Last Days of Dogtown in rural Massachusetts in the 1840s and 50s, people didn't confess to each other that they loved each other, or that they were afraid. So writing about feelings without conversation about feelings is a real challenge, but I have to be careful not to put sort of contemporary words into people's mouths. And with The Red Tent, I mean, who knows what they talked like, but they certainly weren't confessing their feelings about their mother and how they were mistreated as children, sort of thing. So
they didn't have a psychological vocabulary.
No, when we do. And I think we project it back in a way. And that would be a mistake in terms of certainly writing dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Are there any, do you feel particularly close to any of these women, looking back on all of the women you've created?
I have to tell you, after living with a book for 3 or 4 years, I'm very happy to say goodbye. It's been a long time since I even talked in any kind of depth about them. And I have to look at the books again to remember what I did and who they are in some ways. I mean, the heroines in the books are the most important ones. Dina is certainly at the center of that. The book is told in the first person. And so is Boston Girl. That's also told in the first person. So that's a very strong point of view. And it's not my voice exactly. It's a voice in Boston Girl. This is Addie Baum, who was born in 1915, who's talking to her granddaughter. So I'm trying to think about what an 80-year-old woman, what kind of language she would use. And I remember sort of adding a few kind of sexy asides and having her say, hey, you didn't expect that from your grandmother, did you? So that was fun, sort of trying to leaven her as a person, not just serious, but
right.
a character, a real character.
Right. The one departure that occurs to me, I mean, they're all so different, but the only women that I can think of off the top of my head who aren't Jewish are the ones in Dogtown.
Dogtown is the only thing I've ever written with 0 Jews. None. 0. If there were Jews on Cape Ann in that period of time, they weren't particularly, well, they certainly weren't in this book. So yeah, so that's my Americana novel. And when I started working on that book, the first thing I read was The Scarlet Letter, again, because I remembered from college, which I don't remember a lot, about how the landscape is a character in that book, how Hawthorne made the woods and that world alive. And a lot of that book takes place in the woods. So it's a very different point of view and different. It was kind of a relief, There's a sermon by a minister rather than a rabbi in that one.
Right. Well, and the that is, by the way, a wonderful book. I don't know if it's as wide. I know it was a bestseller, but it's not always
for 5 minutes. It's my daughter's favorite book, so it's so that's nice.
And that and is the land. I mean, that and Good Harbor seem to be inspired partly by that Cape Ann, Gloucester area, where I guess.
And actually, Boston Girl started up there too, in a way, because there's a kind of a character in the book called Rockport Lodge, which was a all women's vacation spot that was subsidized by wealthy women for poorer women. That's also on Cape Ann. So Cape Ann is my happy place. It's where I go to look at the ocean. And so those 3 were all inspired by my love of Cape Ann and my experience just being there. So yeah, there's a lot of inspiration from up there.
Mm-hmm. So another through line, besides the landscape and the Jewishness of the characters, obviously another through line for your work is menstruation. And you say you did some journalism on it even at the very beginning, but from the Red Tent to the Mikveh to this work you're doing now on menstrual justice. When we talked before this, in preparation for this, you used a lovely phrase. You said you would become involved with the cycle community. And I wanted to know, can you talk about, what is that like? What's the cycle community like? What's that whole activism been like?
It's the menstrual space, I think, is the.
That's another great expression.
But that's very contemporary language, but it's very live. So this is so unplanned, right? My career, my projects were not mapped out. The things that came up. And for me, the Red Tent is really not so much about menstruation. I mean, the title character is the tent where women would go to menstruate, to give birth and to recover, as I imagined it. Now, there is no documentary evidence that our pre-ancestors actually did that, although there have been pre-modern menstrual places in the world all over, and there still are some. And some of them are horrific, and some of them are quite beautiful. So it's a place where women can be themselves, talk to one another. It's less about menstruation in a lot of ways than it is community, but the blood is part of it, and it's considered normal. And as I wrote it, the tent was not off in the distance; it was in the middle of the family. So the men and boys knew what was going on, and it was an accepted part of life. And so that was that. And when the book first came out, and women particularly would say, I wish I had a red tent, I actually stepped back from that because it felt to me like misplaced nostalgia. You wouldn't want to go back to that time. I would have died in childbirth for sure. No coffee.
Me too.
No anesthesia, no reading, no nothing. But I have come to see that now much more as, actually I'll talk about that when I talk about the third part of it. The mikveh, the impetus for my involvement with the mikveh was really about conversion to Judaism rather than menstruation. When I started working on this, I had passed the age of menstruation, and but I had been working on a book called Choosing a Jewish Life, which is about conversion to Judaism, and I had gone to the one mikveh in the Boston area that was open for conversions one afternoon a week. That was it. And if it was a holiday, it didn't happen that week. And it was not a welcoming, warm place. It was run by the very Orthodox community. And there had been, because it got Federation support, there was a push to make it available. So that one afternoon a week in a place where there was nowhere to sit down and wait for your beloved or your child to convert to Judaism struck me as, I went a lot when I was writing that book with rabbis who were bringing candidates for conversion. So I thought we can do better than this as liberal Jews, to create a place that's open for everybody in the Jewish community, where everybody and their friends and their partners can feel welcome, comfortable, and that they belong there. I actually went to the mikveh before I got married, that mikveh, because I knew that that's what brides did. And I remember feeling like an anthropologist there. It was not a relaxing, much less spiritual experience. So, it had to be better than that. And I heard about people who had better experiences. So that's where that came from. And menstruation was certainly part of it. That's the reason communities build mikvaot. You're supposed to build a mikveh before you build most other things. I think first comes the cemetery, and then comes the mikveh. So I learned a lot about nida and about family, about monthly immersion from other people, and it was fascinating. And that was not my brief. Mine was really about access and fairness. Mm-hmm. And then we get to period end of sentence, which is all about menstruation. And this happened because of a movie called Period End of Sentence. You can't see, I'm blurred. Which was made into a movie. It was a short documentary that won the Oscar for short documentary in 2019. Period End of Sentence tells the story of a small village in India where a donated machine to make menstrual pads has been donated by this a group of high school students in California who had been working with the village about other issues. So you learn about how little is known about menstruation, how stigmatized it is, and how transformative it is to talk to people about it, and for these women to make menstrual pads for themselves and also make them for sale. So they have a micro business, and it's very empowering. So those three, it feels like beginning, middle, and hopefully not the end, but that there is this through line. And, I do write about women. I do focus on women's lives and women's agency. And all three of these points in my life it just so happens to include a lot about menstruation.
Right. Well, and it's not just that it's about women's lives, but it seems, I don't know if this is how it came to you, it seemed to you, but these are unspoken, stigmatized, unwritten parts of women's lives. Things that and women's and kind of, and our own insecurities, our own how we have internalized the shame and the less than-ness that the world tells us that we have been. So, reading Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf described speaking in a women's college where the food was terrible and the rooms were damp and dark. And she had been to Oxford and Cambridge where everyone was eating very well, thank you very much, and the rooms were warm. And she was just noting that, and the lack of the first person female in literature. So that's been the ongoing challenge for women writers and women scholars and women theologians for the past 50 years and some to give women voices and to find our history and in every possible way and to find expression. There's a lovely scene in Period End of Sentence near the beginning where this movie with the same name, the documentary, wins an Oscar. And it's on, international television, and the women are just, we can't believe this is happening. They jump off their couch, they cheer. And so what's the next, how do you build on that? I mean, politically, or what, do you see further steps for yourself, or, what's next in all this?
Well, So I was invited to by the people who made that film to see if I would be interested in writing a kind of companion or in a book. It's really a book that was inspired by the movie more than anything else. So I agreed to do it and started doing research, and COVID happened. And so I spent COVID, our big real lockdown year, doing research on this book, and was overwhelmed with how much information, how many aspects, how many facets, how this is an issue where so many issues, problems, and opportunities intersect. So I jumped off the couch when they said that, and watched it the next day. It's available. I think you can see it on YouTube, period, end of sentence. I don't know if Netflix is still on. I think so. So anybody, it's 20 minutes long. It's terrific. So I said yes, because I really didn't have a project, and this is a subject that I was interested in. And it was really tough getting my arms around how big it was and figuring out a way to present at least aspects of it. It's not exhaustive, that would be an encyclopedia. One of the things that I learned and that I find hopeful and that I hope inspires other people is how much activism there is around the issue of menstrual shame and menstrual pain, and just the unfairness that is visited upon people who menstruate all the time for absolutely no reason except patriarchy. And so, yeah, I learned a lot, but I've been inspired by the number of people who are dedicating themselves to changing this, and on every possible level, by donating things, by submitting bills to their state legislatures and getting laws changed and taxes changed, and mandating that there be products in schools and public spaces, and also raising questions about education, health education, sex education, the role of men around all of this stuff. It's a lot. It starts kind of with products, but it doesn't end with products.
Well, you say in the book that it's sort of a perfect issue for young women, young girls to really join and become activists and sort of work on their own agency.
Yeah, there are so many places, so many countries, so many college campuses, so many junior high schools. When girls find out about the unfairness that other girls are experiencing, in particular, everybody who's menstruated knows the feeling of not having what you need out in public and panicking. And especially when you're an adolescent, and we're talking 11, 12, 13, all the way through, through high school and college. And there's something strikes, I think, them that this is so patently unfair and it doesn't have to be this way. So they start collecting stuff. They learn that they can make a difference. They get featured in the newspaper. And I think it teaches them that they can make a difference, that they can make change. And my great hope is that this generation, who are very creative and outrageous, will understand and take from this experience the sense that they can have a big impact on the world, and take this as far as they want to go, and become active in other ways as well.
Well, I want to circle back to the question of youth involvement in things, but from a different angle. But let me step back for a second and ask you more about the sort of the Jewish community. So you've written these hugely influential guides, the new Jewish ritual, and renewal of Jewish ritual, and moved them along. I think you've not only been reporting on these things, but sort of making them happen to a certain extent. And then more recently, you've revisited some of the older ones and revised them and updated them to reflect changes that you see, some of which, again, you may have created. So it strikes me that when it comes to talking about changes in the community, you've got the best seat in the house. So what do you see? I mean, if you could just look at the most striking changes you've seen in this part of the Jewish community, what might they be? What's changed the most that you've had to update these guides about?
Well, there's so many things. I think I'm about to update Living a Jewish Life, which has been in print for a very long time. And the last update was in 2005 or 2007. And rereading this, it's like, I wouldn't want this, but I don't want this in public anymore. I just feel like, first of all, I am hopefully a better writer. And I think I can do better. But for instance, I just started looking at this, and there's a growing embrace. We're a big tent religion, right? People have always been welcomed in. It hasn't necessarily been celebrated or even acknowledged, but people do join the Jewish community, and we don't look the same. We never have looked the same, and we have always been changing, always throughout history. We wouldn't be here. And looking at what I wrote, 15 years ago, there's like almost no mention of, or barely mention of Sephardic and anything but Ashkenazic tradition and culture. And clearly that's changed, much for the better. It's enriched Jewish life in so many ways. There are mentions of the fact that we are a diverse community in terms of gender, and that was in the book earlier. But Jews of color don't show up in this particular in this book. And then there are other kinds of changes as well. I was looking at the community section. We are in a time when synagogue membership is declining, and people are pulling their hair out about that. But there are other forms of community that are flourishing, and I will write about that. And that includes the online community, includes affinity groups, Jewish affinity groups around music and around art and around theater, and the whole social justice Jews are a community as well. So all of that is, this was very synagogue based in a lot of ways, what I wrote in the past. And while synagogues continue to be important and some are thriving and bringing people in, there's diversity there as well. And then one other thing we talked about when I rewrote the wedding book, we changed the title. It's The Jewish Wedding Now. It's not The New Jewish Wedding. When I first wrote the book, and when I revised it twice, talked about shopping for a rabbi. How do you find someone to perform the ceremony who's going to be your partner in putting together a meaningful ceremony? And when I was doing research on that revision, Rabbi Noah Kushner, who's a friend and who lives in California and runs the kitchen in California, said, you really have to write about why you need a rabbi. It's not just about how to find a rabbi, because we live in a do-it-yourself culture where people, you can deputize anybody to perform a legal wedding ceremony. So there's now a section in that book about what you get, what the added value of having a professional help you with your ceremony. And that includes cantors and rabbis as well, and justices of the peace as well. So that when you have somebody who knows how to hold the room, who's talked to you in advance, who has an understanding of your wedding's place in Jewish history, that's all beautiful and meaningful. But I didn't need to write about that in the two previous updates of that book. So that's a big change in the Jewish community as well.
Right. Well, I'm fascinated that you put it that way in terms of what will a rabbi do for you as a professional who adds value versus who will tell you what's okay. Right? Which used to be there. Traditionally, the rabbi was the one who told you what you could or could not do, at least in many Jewish circles. And everyone still, that's a big change, right? Why is everyone more empowered, or is that just
well, when we're in our community, which is a very well-read community, and a community that thinks that we can do pretty much everything. And we live in a do-it-yourself culture, which if you read the wedding announcements in the New York Times on Sunday, if you were keeping track, I think you'd find more universal life ministers than clergy of any denomination, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu. So it's just the world we live in. And to see the rabbi or to have an officiant who has done this before, who knows how to involve people in a way. I've been to a wedding, do-it-yourself wedding, when I couldn't hear a thing. The very nervous officiant, who wasn't that far away from me, had never done this before. And it didn't matter for the couple actually it wasn't, was it a Jewish wedding? Under the chuppah, there was a chuppah. And so you want to make it an inclusive wedding. I don't know that all couples think about that when they're planning their weddings. And if you've been to a lot of weddings where the universal minister, or the justice of the peace, or the friend who was deputized did an okay job, did a fine job, you don't need a rabbi also. I mean, it's halachically, you don't need a rabbi at all. You marry each other and you need witnesses.
Right.
So that's also empowering for people to realize that they are marrying each other.
Well, how much of all this is powered by the ability to just go online and find what you need to know about Judaism?
Oh, sure.
Jewish
Absolutely.
education's also changed a lot since 2005. Or
absolutely. Oh yeah, I mean, the wedding universe online is enormous, and you can find out a lot about Jewish weddings online as well. I'm grateful that people still want to buy a book about it. But I always thought of my book as a book that you gave to your parents and the other person's parents as well, so that they understood what it was you wanted to make, or what kind of choices you were thinking about. Yeah, but there's so much. Some of it's great. I mean, we're saving a lot of paper by doing online invitations, but you can still do a really meaningful, beautiful Jewish invitation as well. The ketubah is available everywhere online, supporting artists still. So yeah, it's a very different world in terms of putting a wedding together. Making a booklet for a wedding is now a breeze because the templates are all online. So one of the things that changed in the revisions is I don't really have much of bibliographies anymore. First of all, they're very dated. They get dated almost immediately, and you go online and you'll find what you need, with very few exceptions. Then in the Living a Jewish Life book, the children's books, for example, that I listed in 2005 look, very dated. And hopefully the next iteration will be around for another 15 years, and those books will be incredibly dated. So you're going to get dated because things change. That's why.
Well, it's steady work, right? I mean,
well, getting there.
Right. So, let me go back to you a little bit. Let me circle back. And you've said that you educated yourself in large measure, sort of in the process of going through writing these books, and that your own Jewish involvement came from things like youth groups.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that, not just about your experience, but sort of what does it teach you about how to reach young people, Jewish young people? Not to do, I mean, I promised you I'd circle back to the question of youth involvement in politics.
Oh, okay. Well, my family, my parents are survivors. They came to this country. Religion was not, synagogue membership was really not in the cards. We didn't belong to a synagogue till I was 13, and because my brother was 12, and there was going to be a bar mitzvah for him. So we joined this big kind of classical reform congregation in Denver, which I was confirmed. I wore a white robe, the whole thing. But I got involved in NFTY, the National Federation of Temple Youth, which was, the beginning of my Jewish journey in a lot of ways. It was great teachers, great people. And it was my own experience, to be at conclaves and to be at meetings with people who lived in such exciting places as Iowa City, Iowa, and Omaha, Nebraska. So it sort of lit a fire me in a way. So that's where I started. It was as an adolescent, but I really didn't have much of a Jewish education, and it really wasn't until I fell in love with somebody who wasn't Jewish, who then started studying for conversion, that I began my formal Jewish education. So when I was getting married, the rabbi, his sponsoring rabbi and our rabbi for many years, Rabbi Larry Kushner, suggested, I was, what should I write? What should I read, Rabbi, write about Jewish weddings? And he said, you should write a book about Jewish weddings because the book is terrible. And so they were written by etiquette ladies and Orthodox rabbis, and that didn't help me as a feminist Jew in a Reform congregation whose husband had just converted. His mother is a born-again Christian, very happy that her son had found a church. I wrote that book the year after I got married, and that's when I started really getting more and more in depth. Also, when we joined that congregation and I started studying a little bit and learned what Midrash was, that certainly was part of the permission given to me as a Jew to, turn the Torah upside down and do what I wanted with it as an American and as a Jew. I felt like I had permission to do that. So that's sort of the deep background of the Red Tent. But then I had a daughter, and there were really no books about ceremonies for daughters. There were only mimeographs in rabbis' offices. And so that's where that book came from. And then I swore I would never write another Jewish book because I didn't want to be typecast, and then there are 4 more, but never say never. So, so that's my Jewish education. I mean, in terms of youth, I think summer camp and I think youth group are incredibly important because they're experiences that are owned by the young person. It's not your family's Jewish life, it's your Jewish life, separate from your family, and you get to sort of spread your wings that way and explore. And sometimes parents find that very scary for lots of reasons, that kids become more observant or less observant and make their own choices. But making your own Jewish choices is how we ensure a Jewish future, I think. Empowering people to choose and embrace and grow it and change it and add to it.
That's very psychologically apt, very acute. Do you feel like that's still kind of an uphill message to get across in some circles, or? I mean,
I don't know. I don't like the gloom and doom stuff. It's all over. The Jews are the ever dying people. Very, very famous line from some, I think it was a sociologist, the ever dying people. We managed to continue, and with a lot of woe is me and breastfeeding, and everybody says, oh, but this is different. It's worse now than it's ever been. It's always worse now than it's ever been. But there's so much energy in Jewish life. But if it doesn't look like what it looked at like in the past, it scares a lot of people. And as I live in the liberal Jewish community. And actually that's also changed since I tried to describe it in here, that what does that mean now? To the liberal Jewish world is so diverse, so broad, so wide. And I have an Orthodox friend who said, I consider myself a liberal Jew. I think because he understands that we've changed and that change is part of Jewish life. But then there are people who don't. So, I actually don't know what that means anymore, but I know it means we're alive to change, and we're willing to meet it and wrestle with it. We're good at wrestling with it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you visited all these different eras of Jewish history. I guess you can say that with some depth, that this is.
Oh yeah. And if you take a decent Jewish history course, and Boston still has a program called Mayyim, which is 100 hours of study, which was basically a history, and I kept thinking, wow, I feel incredibly justified and authentic as a Jew, reading, learning about the evolution, the change, the ongoing, and the difference between East and West and North and South. So we've never been a monolithic community. We've always changed. And there are parts of our history that we don't know. In the book about conversion, there's a little section called the counter history of conversion. People have been converting to Judaism from the beginning. My blue eyes are not necessarily the result of rape. I mean, I know there is this sort of story that the reason for the physiognomic difference among Jews is to do with violence, but people have married in, people have fallen in love with Jews, people have crept under the tent and just become part of the community. And in biblical times, you would just, you joined the people, and your children were Jewish, period. If you were living in the community and you threw your lot in with us, there was no ceremony. Your kids were Jewish. And I think that's kind of where we are today.
That's interesting that we're
back to that biblical notion, but that's part of our history too.
Mm-hmm. So you're not of the party that thinks that anti-Semitism will send Jews back to their heritage, just, next as it bubbles up, that's, that'll bring everyone home. That's not your.
I feel like Jews have been coming back to their heritage for a long time. I feel like I'm part of that. I think from this, the celebration of diversity, the Six-Day War was a big part of it. And also, and you know, in the 60s and the celebration of Black power and pride and ethnic pride, and we don't need to melt into this pot. We can enjoy our separateness and yet be in community with others, which is hard. I mean, that's a kind of tension. So I think there's been a Jewish renewal, a Jewish renaissance that's been going on for most of my adult life, and I don't think it's over. I think people are concerned about anti-Semitism. I think it has sharpened the political discussion and debate. I don't think, and I hope it doesn't turn us into right-wingers who are so afraid that we circle wagons. Although people, again, through all these years, people have been circling the wagons too, saying, it's awful. Anti-Semites will be back, but really the real problem is assimilation. So there's always a threat, and this is a real threat. We have to take seriously. We have to talk about it and deal with it and teach our children about it, and not flinch and be willing to face the complexities of what that means in the world today, in America today in particular.
So I've monopolized you. I think I'm going to let other people get their licks in, but just so to not end on a downer question anyway, I just thought I'd ask out of pure self-indulgence, are there other Jewish eras that you still want to visit fictionally, or maybe even in the future? Like, I mean, you know, did you ever think about writing a book about the future?
No.
That's an easy one. What about the other?
No, I don't have a fiction project at the moment, so I encounter them in the web, and ideas come to me as I live in my life. And I didn't have any intention of writing a book about menstruation, believe me, but it came to me, and so I'm going to hope that something interesting will come to me. And at the moment, I'm sort of starting to do this revision, and that's going to keep me busy and keep me off the streets.
Well, we're very happy that you're doing whatever you're doing, off the streets or on them. I think, okay. I'm going to let Suzanne collect some questions from the chat. I see a few.
Yes, we have a lot of great questions. Thank you both. That was a fabulous discussion. Before we get started, Anita, I just wanted to show you, this is, I have a kind of see it. It's the original, the very first, the new Jewish wedding. And my husband and I got it before we got married, and it was by our side the entire time of planning the wedding and ceremonies before the wedding and during the wedding. And so I feel like you were a part of my life when we were starting out 25 years ago. I also wanted to say a viewer has said that their son's 3 daughters were converted at Mayyim Hayyim, and his wife, who's not Jewish, but they both wanted to have their girls converted to Judaism. And it was a beautiful ceremony, and just wanted to let you know and thank you for that she had the opportunity, her family, to do that.
Yeah, and here's a part of Jewish life that's changed a lot. Conversion used to be something you whispered about, right? You know, she converted. And you hear people say, oh, that explains it. I didn't think you looked Jewish, right? Which I hope is no longer being said, but I'm afraid it still is. So conversion is now something we celebrate in our community. And that's a tremendous, great, good thing.
Mm-hmm. Someone says they're celebrating their 50th anniversary next week. And do you have any suggestions, contemporary or otherwise, liturgy or ritual to mark the occasion?
Mikveh. Mikveh. We've had people who immersed at Mayyim Hayyim for 25th anniversaries, and I don't know if there's been a 50th, but we've had people do that. And at Mayyim Hayyim, you are in charge of your own immersion, so you can have a witness, you can not have a witness, you can witness one another. And if you're not near a mikveh that's available to you that way, it depends what the rest of your ritual life is. If you're people who do Shabbat, then you do something very special on that Shabbat. You buy those spectacular candles you can find from anywhere and invite people or not invite people. And we don't have rituals for things like that particularly. And it's another reason Mayyim Hayyim exists, is to create the opportunity to sanctify and stop and acknowledge and be grateful for moments like that in one's life. So I don't know if that's helpful, but whatever is meaningful to you in your Jewish life, I would go looking in that and see if there's a way that you can incorporate it into your celebration.
Which authors, Jewish or not, are important to you, had an influence on you?
I don't know why this question always stops me in my tracks, but it does. Jewishly, I think The Sabbath by Heschel was probably one of the most important books I read. It's his most beautifully simple writing, and it's the most powerful message as well. I read a lot of poetry. Has been really important to me, and that includes Walt Whitman and Pablo Neruda and Yehuda Amichai and Mary Oliver, who is the psalmist of the 20th century for every religious tradition. I love Billy Collins because he's funny. For the last few years, especially since COVID started, I have a real hard time reading fiction. I mean, I've started, I think, 10 books and stopped. They just didn't grab me. So I'm in a funny place with reading these days.
Thank you. Which will actually, the next question is about fiction. When you begin a novel, do you already know what the ending is, or does it reveal itself as you write each chapter?
I usually know kind of what the end is. I don't necessarily know how we're going to get there. The one time I tried writing without knowing what the end was my worst experience writing a novel. But so with the Red Tent, I knew she was going to die at the end. Spoiler alert, that was the end of her life, was going to be the end of the book. With The Last Days of Dogtown, that was going to end when the last person left this rural community, and it was the end of this settlement. So yeah, it's important. I have sort of in the distance there, I kind of know where we're going, but I don't know exactly how I'm getting there.
What the people are going to do is not so clear. How they're going to.
Oh, no. I mean, there's sort of it's nice to have an arc and sort of know where it's heading and that there's an end somewhere. But the characters develop in rewriting, you know. I don't know, revealing it themselves is funny language, but it's in the hard work of rewriting that characters come to have their own, that I figure out who they are.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that the Red Tent became such a sensation, particularly with book clubs?
I think because there's a lot to talk about, actually. I think from hearing from book groups, I've heard there's a lot of conversation about family, my family, your family, mothers, sisters, daughters. And the intergenerational nature of it has become really interesting to me. I remember when it first came out and I was at a bookstore and a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter all came to get a book signed. And it had never occurred to me that it would have that kind of an impact. For some people, Jews and Christians as well, the telling a story from the point of view of women whose names are known in the Bible, but whose stories aren't known, was very powerful. It made them feel there was a way for themselves to read themselves into the text. And by the same token, I heard from people who didn't know anything about these characters. And a friend of mine said, "Why didn't you tell me it was coming? There's this horrible massacre, and I was reading at night, and I couldn't sleep." And so there are all kinds of ranges there. So there are religious conversations, there's family conversations, there's social organization questions about what life is like for women in pre-modern times. So I think that you can have opinions, but there's no sharp answer because we don't know enough to really nail down some of the answers to the questions that I raised in it. Mm-hmm. What was life like for these people?
You think you gave other women permission to do feminist midrash in the way you said you felt you were given permission once you learned about midrash? Did other people, I mean, there's been a lot of sort of feminist retelling after you. Do you think you opened that door?
Well, the door was open. I'm certainly not the first person to do this. Telling the story of a historical period from a minor character. The Last Temptation of Christ actually is that kind of book, which was a huge bestseller. And there's a book called The Miracle Hater, by in this little novel about somebody who goes on the Exodus with Moses, who's just nobody, I don't think he's ever named even, but that perspective on the Exodus, I can't remember the name of the author, I'm sorry, was really interesting. And I read Clan of the Cave Bear, and I read, you know, and when I was reading this, and I was also reading the Arthurian one, you know.
Oh, Myths of Avalon?
Yes, Myths of Avalon, and thinking, so those are all retellings from a very different point of view. So I sort of entered that tradition, and historical fiction has become, and it was already starting to be, you know, a thing. People were really interested in learning about history through fiction. It's easier, and if the writer is responsible, they do their research, and so there are no wristwatches in the red tent, and nobody eats chicken in the red tent. So the book, not the tent. Right. So, and you know, that's true even in contemporary stuff. When I was working on Day After Night, I sent a draft to somebody who was helping me with Hebrew in Israel, and she said they wouldn't have been eating apples at this season. So I thought, ooh, she saved me from making a mistake that would have been obvious to somebody else. So I really dread that, you know, of having someone read it and go, they didn't eat apples then. What does she know? She's, you know, so no anachronisms.
I want to let everybody know that I put a link in the chat to Anita's website, so you can check out all of her books that she has written. I've also put a link to the PAD project where the period end of sentence documentary is. And I've also put a link to Mayyim Hayyim, the Mikveh that Anita helped co-found. So you can get all of that information there. And we'll also put it in a follow-up email to everyone after today's session ends. I want to move on to some questions about your latest book. We do have some men on this, but not a lot. And so the question is, why should this cause of menstrual justice not just be a women's issue? And what's the best way to encourage men to be a part of the conversation, even though many of them are still uncomfortable with the topic?
Great question. There's a chapter in the book called Men-Duration, which includes, actually sort of starts with, you know, what somebody posted online, what's the most ridiculous thing a man has ever said to you about your period? And some of them are very funny and some of them are cruel, but mostly the chapter is full of men behaving beautifully, of examples of dads doing right by their daughters who get their first period, of teenage boys helping when they see a woman, one of their classmates with a stain on her pants. The cab driver in South Africa who, when he noticed bloody tissues on the floor in the back of his cabs, bought pads and put them for free on the dashboard. So there are stories of men who just sort of step up and take care and are just menschlich. And I think we're missing those stories. There are lots of men who are not squeamish and who are brilliant, and we don't really see them. They're not featured anywhere. It's really important that sex education be all genders in the room at the same time. Talked to a wonderful a man in Minnesota who's a sex education and works a lot with men and boys. And by being in the same room and having the same vocabulary and learning empathy for one another is crucial. And it hasn't been part of our lives at all. And there have been cultures, indigenous cultures, where the entire community, men, women, people of all genders and ages, acknowledged and even celebrated the beginning of a girl's menstruation because it was seen as the proof of continuity, that life would continue and that the community would continue. So there's lots of work to do, and I think there's lots of room for men to be part of this as well. And we all have moms and sisters and daughters and friends, and it's within reach. It's not that hard. And I found when I started writing this book, and I took a deep breath when some man asked me what I was working on, I said, well, I don't know if you want to hear this. And I stopped doing that pretty quickly. I'm writing about menstruation. And the first thing I said was, are you carrying toilet paper around with you? And everybody goes, oh, I guess not. I guess I don't. And I guess if you need menstrual products, you should have them. And that opens the door to questions about women's role in society and who's in and who's out and who's taken care of and who isn't.
That's actually a good segue to the next question. Many groups, including many synagogues, particularly the sisterhoods, have taken up the cause and organized collections. In your opinion, is that enough? And what more can and should be done?
I think it's great. And it's just the beginning, I think, of activism. And that can include in whatever state you're living in, people are getting rid of sales tax on menstrual products, for example. So, and every state decides what you put sales tax on and what you exempt, and necessities are exempted. So this is happening in Massachusetts here, with very liberal state. And if they pass the bill in front of the legislature, which has been languishing, we'll have one of the most liberal in the country, which means all schools and all municipal buildings, and all schools, all shelters, all prisons will have products for everybody. And it opens the door to a conversation about who counts in the most basic of ways. And I'm thrilled to say that more and more synagogues are putting products out in their bathrooms all the time, not just when there's a wedding or a bar mitzvah, that there should be period products in your home and in your synagogue, because what we have to do is normalize this. So you can do very personal things, like make sure in the vanity where your guests are, they see that you have tampons and pads or whatever out on the vanity, along with soap and a towel. So there's large and small ways to work on this. There are issues of equity, there are issues about medicine, there's issues, and of course, poverty exacerbates the problems of anybody who's facing, who menstruates and can't afford what they need and don't get the health care they need. So all of these things intersect.
Great. And we have to wrap up. So I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but we'll end on one more question about celebration. Besides the mikveh, do you have any thoughts about a celebration or a way of honoring menopause?
Well, people have come to the mikveh to celebrate menopause. Menopause is kind of weird because you sort of start your period, and it takes a long time before you're really finished with menopause. It's a sort of slow rollout, and people have celebrated it in different ways. Some with ceremonies, although they, for the most part, feel manufactured rather than authentic, which is why mikveh is good, because it's an old thing and you can sort of just can use it that way. But it's a hard one, and we don't have any models for this. And in terms of Judaism, we have no models for marking the life cycle of the female body, in particular, beginning of menstruation, deciding to have a baby, ending nursing, deciding to stop having children, infertility, all of the life cycle of the body, of the female body, the body with a uterus, has, we have 100 blessings, you say, every day. Well, there's a lot of blessings missing. So we have to face that it's really not part of our tradition, and there's no reason not to add them. I mean, there's no halachic reason not to add blessings. So the more blessings, the better.
Well, I hear you just outlined a new book.
No.
Well, our time has come to a close. I want to thank you both, Anita and Amy. This has been a wonderful, wonderful program. I really appreciate it. As I mentioned, I will send a follow-up email at the end of the week, and you will receive all of the links that are also in the chat. I want to remind everybody to go to momentmag.com, where you can sign up for our next Zoominar in 2 weeks. It's with the actor and co-creator of Asylum City, an Israeli very popular television show. And once you register, you'll be able to get a link to watch the first 3 episodes. Again, thank you both, and we'll see everybody next time. Take care.
You.
Bye.
Thanks.